Happening today, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff heads to Russia as the Trump administration is pushing to end the war in Ukraine. This morning, the Kremlin has confirmed that Vladimir Putin will, quote, receive Witkoff for talks. As of now, it is unclear if President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, will also be on that trip. Witkoff's Moscow visit comes on the heels of high-level talks with Ukrainian officials. You'll remember that happened in Florida over the weekend. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sounded optimistic after the meeting. President Trump sharing that sentiment.
Ukraine's got some difficult little problems. They have some difficult problems, but I think Russia would like to see it end, and I know Ukraine would like to see it end.
You just said that Ukraine has a little bit of problems.
Well, we have a corruption situation going on, which is not helpful. There's a good chance we can make a deal.
CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh is live on the ground in Kyiv for us. Nick, what are you hearing about from there about how these talks are progressing?
Yeah, I mean, key to put out positive messaging that there is some sort of progress they feel at hand. But clearly, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is saying there's still a lot of difficult work potentially ahead and a lot of choreography diplomatic movement over the next 48 hours. President Zelensky of Ukraine currently in Paris meeting Emmanuel Macron tomorrow. He'll head to Ireland. Parts of his negotiating team have been headed towards Ireland ultimately as a destination as well to likely debrief him in person, he has said. And then Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, headed to the Kremlin, likely with some sort of revised plan to present in front of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Likely, I would imagine the Kremlin have a pretty good idea what might be in that. And I think from the signals we're seeing here, this is ultimately going to rest on whether or not they can somehow thread the needle or create some kind of fudge as to where the front line ultimately sits in the event of some kind of peace deal. There is the Kremlin's maximalist demand that they get all of the Donetsk region. They've said that from the start, although they appear to have slightly reduced their demands for the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. But Ukraine, up until months ago, considered that kind of concession a complete red line. They likely still do, but I think we're seeing some of the language here revolve around the idea of territorial swaps. There are parts of Ukraine that Russia occupies that they might potentially withdraw from. All of this, though, exceptionally politically dicey for Volodymyr Zelensky, his chief of staff, his top negotiator, resigning after having his home raided by anti-corruption investigators just on Friday. Now, that may to some degree have confused or hobbled Ukraine's stance at the talks in Florida, but they do still appear to have moved ahead with adequate pace. And I think there are many deeply concerned here in Ukraine is exactly what the nature of the offer Witkoff is travelling with. There are many circumstances around it and revolving Ukrainian membership of NATO, potential elections in Ukraine here, the geopolitical stance of Ukraine and generally European allies and their assistance to Ukraine in the future. These are future ideas which will likely end up being changed as time goes by. The ultimate crux of a deal or no deal is this issue of territorial concessions and an end to the war that lasts. That also requires security guarantees, and they seem also still to be being hammered out. Sarah?
All right, Nick Payton-Walsh, thank you for your reporting there from Kyiv for us on the ongoing talks there. John?
With this is Congressman Adam Smith from Washington, Democrat, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us. Steve Witkoff on his way to Moscow. He might meet with Vladimir Putin. What do you think he's bringing with him, and how much faith do you have in his negotiating?
I don't have a lot of faith. I think what he's bringing with him is the message to Vladimir Putin that the sweetheart deal that he was trying to give him just isn't going to work. There was sufficient pushback in the U.S. and a variety of different places, certainly from Europe and Ukraine, that deal is going to have to fundamentally change. Whether or not Russia will be open to that, it's hard to say, because remember what Putin wants. He wants control of all of Ukraine. It does not look like he's going to be able to achieve that. But does he know that yet? And is he willing to cut a deal short of that? The key's on our side. Ukraine has to be able to defend itself going forward. There have to be significant security guarantees. And Ukraine certainly can't be giving territory to Russia that Russia hasn't even taken yet. So I think there's a long way to go to actually get to a peace agreement.
we'll see what happens in the next few days.
U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is heading to Russia today as the Trump administration's diplomatic push to end the war in Ukraine continues. The Kremlin confirmed Vladimir Putin will, quote, receive Witkoff for talks. It's unclear if President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, will also be on the trip. Witkoff's Moscow visit comes on the heels of high-level talks with Ukrainian officials in Florida that happened over the weekend. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sounded optimistic after that meeting.
Much work remains, but today was again a very productive and useful session where I think additional progress was made. And we continue to be realistic about how difficult this is, but optimistic, particularly given the fact that as we've made progress, I think there is a shared vision here that this is not just about ending the war, which is very important. It is about securing Ukraine's future.
So we're seeing Marco Rubio here, group chat, come to the forefront of this after that very sort of messy first couple of weeks. And people are now looking, though, at Witkoff and his role. I think they're adding more scrutiny. Congressman Don Bacon was writing online after this report from the Wall Street Journal that it is clear that Witkoff fully favors the Russians. He should be fired. We're quoting Don Bacon a lot today, so he's obviously upset at many things. But this, he's following up reporting from the Wall Street Journal about Witkoff's relationship.
Yeah, he's sort of emerged as a Republican antagonist for President Donald Trump in their second term.
One for each topic, basically. We'll move to Tom Massey next.
But as far as the Russia-Ukraine talks themselves go, Marco Rubio went on to say that there's two parties involved in this, and one of them is Russia. And so anything that they agree upon with the Ukrainians will also have to be agreed upon by the Russians. And the Russians have said all along that they have several red lines, including the expansion of NATO, as well as Ukraine's ability to ever be able to join NATO. Those are things that Ukraine has consistently rejected. And of course, we've heard European countries also take issue with some of these things that were in this
and
initial
I'm glad you're pointing this out, because we hear it in very vague terms when you hear just like security, secure, future.
Right.
That actually is about a hard and bright line that is under question.
Right. Like what does security, or long-term security for Ukraine look like? Does that have a U.S. security commitment? That is something that has been a key Russian sticking point, Ukrainian sticking point. It doesn't seem like they've made any clear progress on that. The comments that Secretary Rubio said, he referred to this as delicate right now. We heard President Trump back in August when he met with President Putin in Alaska. He said that they had only, they'd agreed to a lot, that there were only a couple sticking points left. These are huge sticking points, and it's unclear if they're really making any big headway on these. And it comes when there's increasing pressure here in the U.S. There's Republicans in Congress pushing to impose some steeper sanctions on Russia this week.
I think you saw what they did with Gaza, and they tried to replicate that with this type of peace negotiation. The problem is when you go in on one polar side, you risk alienating the side that you also have to work with, which is what happened not just with Ukrainian officials, but with Republicans in Congress who came out after that 28-point plan was leaked and said, this looks like Russian talking points.
And then said, we asked him if it was Russian talking points, and he said, yes. They didn't have to reveal that, and they did.
Yes, they admitted to it, and I think that's because that's part of their negotiation tactics, right? You start on one polar side, and you try to get the other to move along with you. The challenge, though, became the pushback from Republicans who said that this is just not the way that we go into this war. We, from a national security perspective, in the United States have a vested interest in ensuring the security of Ukraine long term and ensuring that our European allies are not pissed off at this plan.
Which they were.
Very pissed off.
Going back to what you were saying about Don Bacon, though, this has emerged as another rift in the Republican Party that President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance have had to do. In response to some of those criticisms from Mitch McConnell and other Republicans, the Vice President of the United States hit back very hard on social media at the establishment Republicans, saying that this was DC, just essentially DC insiders who were upset about this. But it wasn't just the DC insiders; it was America's allies, and of course the Ukrainians, who also have to agree to this.
And just quickly on the Republican pushback, first it was the Epstein files, Donald Trump having to switch his position, knowing that he was going to get blown out by that vote. Then it was the Ukraine issue. All of these Republicans on Capitol Hill saying, what is this 28-point plan? Why are we siding with Russia? And now it's the whole situation with Venezuela of Republicans coming out against Donald Trump. This is a clear pattern ending the year that I was not expecting at the beginning of it.
We're going to talk about it more because also some people are heading to the exits as a result.